On this episode, we're heading into the Overlook Hotel for one of the most controversial films of all time. We're talking about Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. A lot of people consider this to be one of the best horror movies, maybe one of the best movies of all time, although a lot of other people also think that it's an overrated piece of garbage, and it was nominated for multiple Razzies in the year that it was released. So clearly opinions are split on this film, but one thing you must agree on is that this film has a lot of unanswered questions, and we're going to look into some of those today. Now, this film does have a lot of symbolism, a lot of contextual meanings, a lot of metaphorical meanings. We're going to kind of skip over some of those and stick to a more story-based answer, but maybe we'll get into some of that other stuff at a later date. Maybe I'll use my shine. Question number 1. Was Ullman evil? Stuart Ullman is the general manager of the Overlook Hotel, and he hires Jack to be the caretaker during the winter months. He lets Jack know about the Grady incident, in which a previous caretaker went crazy and killed his family over the long winter. He then proceeds to prep Jack for his stay, and it's ultimately a pretty short role in the story, but it's still enough time for some pretty wild conspiracy theories. And no, I'm not talking about the whole Ullman boner theory thing. There's a theory that Ullman himself is a ghost, and it's actually setting Jack up to, quote, feed the hotel. With the movie as it is, it's a pretty thin theory with not a lot of evidence to support it, except the fact that he's aware of the hotel's history and the fact that it rests on an Indian burial ground. You could assume that Ullman had knowledge of Jack's violent past and issues with alcohol and felt like he was the perfect fit for what he needed to happen over the winter. This is in contrast to his book version that specifically didn't want Jack for the job because of his background, which could just be Kubrick having a different vision for the character, or his indication of a more sinister plot. Again, with the movie as it is, this is a pretty thin theory, but what about the original ending? You see, when the film was first in theaters, there was this ending where Danny and Wendy are safe in the hotel afterwards, and Ullman comes to visit them. The scene ends with him ominously tossing that famous tennis ball to Danny. The scene ran in theaters for literally 2 days before being pulled and removed, and all footage of it is presumed to be lost forever, although photos of it do exist. So what does the ball mean? Is Ullman a ghost? Is he responsible for what happened in room 237? Well, considering Kubrick removed this and the scene literally no longer exists, I think we can just consider it not canon, and with very little other evidence to point to the old GM as anything other than what he seems, I think that we can safely say that he's oblivious to the dangers of what's about to happen, although it's certainly open for interpretation, because y'all gonna interpret. I know you. Question number 2. Why is Halloran so afraid of room 237? When Danny and Dick meet, Danny uses the shine to read Halloran's mind and finds out that he's afraid of room 237. But if our favorite chef is fully aware of all of the evil that occurred in the hotel, including a whole family being chopped to pieces, what specifically was it about that room that he was more afraid of? I mean, there's dead bodies in the halls and an elevator of blood, so it seems like they would be areas that he'd be afraid of instead of the room. Ullman says that Grady killed his family and then stacked them neatly in one of the rooms in the West Wing, which you would presume to be 237 then, but why would he be afraid of the room in which the bodies were placed instead of where they were killed? Well, if the woman in the tub in the room during the later scene has the same backstory as the character from the book, she also died in that room. You see, her name is Lorraine Massey, who killed herself there in 1975, which would have only been a few years prior to the events of the film. You could see that as an indication that the room itself is the epicenter of the hotel's evil, and in particular it is something to be feared more so than the overall Overlook, and that's the most likely obvious answer, as it's right after Jack's incident there that his downward slide ramps up and he goes from, hey, I'm crazy enough to hallucinate a bartender, to, hey, this imaginary butler is telling me to chop up my family. Question number 3. And hey, speaking of that dude, what Grady is that? So early in the film, as Ullman is telling Jack the story of the hotel's sordid past, he refers to the whole silly axe incident as the handiwork of former caretaker Charles Grady. Later on, when Jack meets this spectral drink wiper, he introduces himself as Delbert Grady. Jack's reaction is to ask him if he used to be the caretaker, but never brings up the name discrepancy, which I think is kind of weird. If somebody told you that Jeff Michaels killed someone and later you made a guy named Tom Michaels, I'm not sure that you'd ask him if he was the same guy. Especially since it's not even a simple name mix-up, as it's pretty hard to assume that Charles and Delbert were similar enough to confuse. There's a lot of deeper interpretations here as we dip into the themes of fate and reincarnation that are within the film, although there is a fairly mundane answer if you don't want to get into all of that, which is kind of what we're doing, but, you don't have to swear by it. Jack says that he saw Delbert's picture in the newspaper, which is how he put it together. So what if Ullman simply got the name wrong? It's possible that Ullman just mixed up the story and gave the wrong name, and when Jack is seen with the scrapbook later, he read the whole story and saw the correct name in the stories. So when he introduces himself as Delbert Grady, Jack knows exactly who he's talking about. I understand that that's a boring interpretation, but the other version that's popular is that Charles is Delbert's son, which points to the hereditary aspect of mental health that the film definitely dips into with Jack and Danny, and also a version that backs up the reincarnation aspect of the film, and that Charles is a reborn Delbert, constantly returning to the hotel to create mayhem. Question number 4. Hey, speaking of mayhem, the hell is this thing? So let's look at this, if we have to. It's a person, most likely male from the general shape, although that's kinda debatable. It could just be a hefty woman wearing a bear suit? Dog suit? They appear to be engaged in a sex act with a man in a tuxedo, and there's nothing violent, and all you see is a naked butt, but it's easily one of the more disturbing images in all of horror. There's a deeper meaning theory about the implications of the bear symbolism tied to the abuse between Jack and Danny, but let's look at it with a more face value. Again, if you look to the books, it's pretty much spelled out for you there, as that scene is a depiction of a spiritual tryst between two men. The bear man, who was wearing a dog suit in the novel, is named Roger and has a sexual encounter with Horace Derwent, who is the owner of the Overlook Hotel. Now, that backstory isn't present in the movie, but knowing what we know about the contexts of the ghosts, we can generally assume that they're the spirits of people who either had a traumatic experience at the hotel or possibly died there at some point. Obviously, their taboo affair was a prominent part of their ordeal, enough to stick with them through their spiritual life. Question number 5. I talked about the River of Blood earlier, so what was that? All of the apparitions that we see in the hotel are real things that happened there. Even though they're not fleshed out in the movie, we can make some assumptions about them without even using the novel. We can assume the woman in the bathtub is someone that killed herself or died there. The Grady twins we know the story of. The bear suit couple we've already talked about. All of these spirits have a backstory in the hotel that we either know from the book or we can make inferences from the context of the film. Their appearances don't seem to be exaggerated unless you're counting the tub woman, who at times is young and beautiful and later an old twisted hag, I guess. So was the River of Blood a real event? I mean, I really doubt it, since that would require a huge amount of dead people, and it would seem that an incident such as that would be something to talk about with Jack instead of the Grady incident, so we can assume that those murders were at the very least the worst that happened there. If I hired someone, you can rest assured that one of the things I would mention would be the Blood River. So what is it? Well, since there's no literal way to talk about it without just saying the hotel is evil and showing Wendy its spooky, gross side, there's the contextual views. Since we know that the hotel is sitting on an Indian burial ground and the elevator traditionally represents going up and down, you can view it as the blood of the native people spilling out, escaping up through the shafts like a twisted aorta. There's a theme throughout the film of American versus Native iconography, so that would be another example of that imagery, especially considering the decorations adorning the elevators themselves. But more importantly, is there something in the blood? Well, that's a question for another time. Question number 6. Since we're talking about hidden symbolism for a moment, what about Danny's Apollo 11 sweater? So because of Danny's sweater here, which shows the Apollo 11, and some of Jack's type looks like an 11 instead of the word all, and the moon being 237,000 miles from Earth, so Kubrick changed the novel's room 217 to 237, people think that the moon landing was fake and that Kubrick actually shot the footage that we saw, and this was his way of letting the world know. So, is it true, even though the Earth is actually more like 238,000 miles away, did Kubrick film a fake moon landing? No. Question number 7. We've talked a lot about ghosts, so I'm going to say something right now that's going to throw all of that off. Are the ghosts even real? Now, there's been a lot of interpretations of this movie, and I think that Roger Ebert himself was one of the first people to create a non-supernatural theory of the film in his review, which attributes most of the supernatural elements of the film to the family's mental states. I think even if you take this tact, you have to at least consider Danny's shine ability to be real based on his mind conversation with Halloran, but in terms of there being actual ghosts, still open to interpretation. Kubrick himself basically finished off the argument in a 1980 interview with the Washington Post, saying that the film was just the story of one man's family quietly going insane together, which seems to insinuate that he's downplaying the ghostly aspects of things. But in another interview with Michael Cement, he states that Grady opening the door left no other explanation but the supernatural. So it seems that not even Kubrick himself is willing to nail himself down to one option. So, I'm gonna throw something else at you. What if there were no ghosts, but it's not just all 3 family members going insane coincidentally at the same time? What if the answer is in Danny? Dick tells Danny that the shine is like pictures in his head, suggesting an ability to manifest imagery. So what if Danny is able to read the atrocities of the hotel's past from Halloran's head and is simply manifesting them throughout using his powers? He could be inadvertently, or I guess possibly advertently, responsible for Jack and Wendy's vision, showing them imagery of what happened there. I mean, right after he tells his mom about the woman in room 237, Jack sees her. Immediately after Danny asks Jack if he'd ever hurt him and Wendy, Jack has a dream about killing them, as if it was implanted in his head. Hell, you can even use this to explain what the River of Blood was, since it's just a representation of the carnage pulled from Dick's head. The more frantic that Danny gets, the more intense and broad the emanations get. Keep in mind that this version doesn't work as well when you consider Dr. Sleep, although since it's unclear as to whether that is a sequel to the book or to the movie, I guess you can decide for yourself if you want to call that canon or not, but it still kind of works. Now, I'm not saying that this is the theory that I ascribe to, but I just think that it's actually an interesting way to read the film. Question number 8. But hey, if there's no ghosts, then who lets Jack out of the storeroom? There are so many theories on this one floating around on the internet that it seems silly to even bring it up. I'm sure there's about a dozen videos right here on YouTube that are devoted entirely to this question, and you can pick and choose from any of them. I guess the most obvious of the answers is that it's the ghost of Grady, as indicated by Kubrick in his interview, and that's what's known in the trope world as the Word of God. If Kubrick says that that's what it is, then that's probably the most concrete answer that you're gonna get. That doesn't mean that you have to go all in on that answer though, as that's the beauty of the way that it's filmed. Any of the theories out there work, from that bar that Jack is playing around with being a safety catch for the door, to the lock simply being broken, to Wendy's inability to work the lock preventing her from securing it properly, to Danny himself opening the door under the influence of his own visions. But ultimately, I think there's two ways to go here. If you're all in with there being no ghosts and nothing supernatural happening, you can simply assume that there's a failsafe enabling him to get out of the door. I don't know this firsthand, but I asked a few friends that worked in kitchens with big freezer pantries, and they stated that the ones that they worked in definitely had fail-safes to ensure that no one gets locked in. So that's an easy way to figure that Jack gets out, but keep in mind that he's delusional at that point, so it could be that he himself strongly believes that Grady is the one that sets him free. The easier answer is the one that the book offers, is backed up by Kubrick, and is also backed up by Dr. Sleep if you choose to see that as canon to the film, which sounds good to me, and that answer is that the hotel has ghosts that really like Danny because of his ability to shine, and free Jack in order to claim him. Why this is the only time they choose to interact with the real world is another question, I guess. Question number 9. Near the end of the film, Danny loses Jack in the maze by hiding his own footsteps, and Jack gets lost and eventually, I guess, just walks around looking for him. Danny's clever and escapes, and Jack freezes to death, but why didn't he just follow his own footsteps out? So originally I had just assumed that Jack was just obsessed with finding Danny at all costs and just figured he was still in the maze and continued to look until he just froze. But on rewatch, he hears the truck pulling away and yells in anger that Wendy and Danny are getting away. So he clearly hears them outside of the maze. All that he would have to do then was follow his own steps out. It's not like he explored that much of the maze at that point, so it shouldn't matter that he couldn't follow Danny's footsteps when he had his own trail to follow out. All he had to do was look down, and if there's no steps in the snow, then turn around. Sure, he may have come back around to a few of his dead ends, but it shouldn't be that crazy to get out. I mean, it's snowing, so I guess that it's a theory that the snow coming down covered up his steps to where he couldn't see them, which I guess is a possibility even though it doesn't seem like it's coming down all that hard. But in his heightened state of rage, the confusion of the snow coming down hard and the covering of the new snow plus possible spiritual influence, I'm going with that making it so that he's not so clear-headed enough to just do so. Plus, he's clearly exhausted and it's enough to make him just have a seat and become a Jaxicle. Question number 10. Okay, here's the big one. What's up with that photograph at the end? So after Jack is dead and Wendy and Danny have gotten away, we see a photograph from 1921, and it's clearly the event that Jack had seen in the ballroom, except he's now a partygoer there. It's the most famous mind twist of the entire film, with no clear answers and about 1 billion theories and possibilities suggested over and over and over again. But is there a clear answer as to what it means? Well, not really. And it's not even something that's in the novel for additional information, but there is some extra stuff to feed off of. Kubrick himself, in that same interview we talked about earlier, explicitly said about the ending that the ballroom photograph suggests the reincarnation of Jack. So that gives us something. We know that it involves reincarnation, but even that clear statement leaves itself open to interpretation. The one suggestion that I've seen is that Jack is actually the reincarnation of a former guest of the hotel, and the photograph is real. The person in the photo is someone from 1921 who went to a party at the hotel, and at some point later they obviously died, most likely not actually at the hotel since their ghost cannot be seen there, and they were reincarnated as Jack, who fate has now led back to the Overlook in a vicious cycle. The same theory can also apply to and explain the Charles/Delbert situation, with Charles being the reincarnation of a former hotel worker who was led back to the chaos in much the same way. I personally am not a big fan of this theory, as I don't think that picture would have gone unnoticed. I'm sure that the family would have spotted someone who looks just like Jack front and center in a photograph that is prominently featured in a pretty high focus point of the hotel. It's not like they didn't have time to fill to walk around and see these things, and I just feel like they would have seen it. Unless, of course, the guy in the photo doesn't look like Jack and the actual guy in the photo looks different but has the same soul as Jack, and we as the audience are allowed to see that, whereas the movie characters would not. The other, I think, more obvious answer is that Jack is reincarnated into the hotel as a ghost, now a part of the spectral hotel's menagerie. Like Grady told him that he's always been there, of course, not that he's been there literally, but that he's meant to be there as the caretaker from then on. Again, not that he's physically always been there, but that it's always been his fate. This would be the more likely answer to it, especially if you want to consider Dr. Sleep canon to the film, as it seems to solidly confirm this notion. Again, that's if you want to A, consider that film to be a follow-up to this one, and B, that the spirit in that film is actually supposed to be Jack and not just the hotel playing tricks with Danny and showing him what he wants to see in order to get the desired reaction that it needs. That's also if you want to consider that, again, there are any ghosts at all, even with Dr. Sleep in consideration. After all, the spirits we see there, again, can simply be a manifestation of Danny's shine and not literal ghosts. In which case, Jack could have just been a portion of his subconscious. Either way, I think the simplest answer is that the photograph represents what Kubrick said, and that a reincarnation as Jack has left his physical body and his spirit is reborn into the hotel. So there you have it, 10 questions about one of the most mysterious films of all time. I know this might be blasphemy, but I myself am one of the ones that like to watch this movie on a purely base level where there are ghosts. It's kind of more like the novel where the ghosts are real. Jack is seeing the ghosts because they are tapping into him because they are upset. They want Danny's shine power, much like as shown in Dr. Sleep. I know it's not as exciting as the kind of metaphorical, subliminal stuff that is going on in that film, but I'm a little bit more literal kind of guy. I do love all of the interpretations and different avenues of dissection that this movie creates in the film world, and I want to see some of the opinions that you guys have on that down below in the comments. Let me know what you think about The Shining. I'm sure a lot of you guys are going to tell me how this movie's terrible, and hey, opinions are opinions. They're all good. But back them up down below there too. If you think any of my explanations for things are complete garbage, that's fine. This movie is open to interpretation. I'm not saying that my answers are gospel. I'm saying that they are one possible interpretation. That's what's cool about this movie and why 40 years later we're still talking about it. I think it's a great movie. If you think differently, down below, like, subscribe, comment, share this up on all those sharing social media thingy-mabobbers. Check out the patrons over here because these guys help support the channel, which you can too on patreon.com/movietimelines. Help keep this channel going. And you are doing a great job of helping support this channel by just watching these videos, which hopefully you will do again in a very short amount of time for another great video. Thanks, guys.